Welcome to another edition of Church and State with Chris Farrar and Brian McCall. Good to see you again, Chris. We live in interesting times.
Good to see you too, Brian. Let's
So I
have
think
at it.
let's have at it. There's a lot there. Let's start with the church, and there's kind of two interesting stories that I think show the crisis in the church, both in Rome and back at home. So this past week, it was announced that the Pope, who doesn't like to call himself Pope, the Bishop of Rome, as he prefers to call himself, he thinks there's a distinction there, met with Father James Martin, S.J., who I like to refer to as a sometime Jesuit. And the interesting is, our viewers probably are familiar with him. He's very outspoken, essentially in support of sodomy and changing the church's teaching with respect to sodomy. And it has a whole, quote, ministry to LGBTQ Catholics, which is kind of a bizarre term in itself because there are just Catholics struggling with all their different sins, but we don't go around saying, oh, that's a burglar Catholic. Oh, that's a lying Catholic, right? We don't identify Catholics by their
The adulterer community.
right, exactly. But that's sort of what they've turned into. So anyway, this priest is a real scandal to the faith because he goes around giving the impression that there's nothing wrong with this. So he meets for an hour. Again, it's nearly impossible to get to see the Pope one-on-one. He gets an hour there with the Pope, and then he tweets afterwards.
45 minutes. Oh
Yeah.
my God.
I was deeply grateful to meet Pope Francis in the Apostolic Palace this morning for 45 minutes, during which we spoke about the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of LGBTQ, XYZ, ABC, Catholics. It was a warm, inspiring, and encouraging meeting that I'll never forget. So again, its actions speak louder than words. By the Pope meeting with him, giving all this time to him, and then again letting him tweet this out. It wasn't that the Pope called him in to correct him and say, you got to reaffirm church teaching, these are intrinsically evil actions. He lets him publicly make a statement like that and say nothing. And so how is this sort of emblematic of Francis's, quote, magisterium to undermine the faith this way?
Well, his entire pontificate has been an endorsement of the LGBTQ non-existent community. There is no such community. There's just a number of people who are committing sins that cry out to heaven, who need our prayers, our help, and the salvific grace of God, not support as LGBTQ Catholics. So his whole pontificate has been a demonstration of how sympathetic he is to the community that so-called that is engaged in sodomy. So he's had homosexual couples. One of them was a friend of his come to the Vatican, or actually during his United States appearance, a special audience. And transgender people have come to the Vatican, and in one case at his expense, to meet with him. He gave them an envelope full of cash. The transgender, whatever the gender this person was, reported that he got an envelope of cash from the Pope to reimburse him for his travel expenses. And he showed up with his so-called wife. And that was another travesty. So this is just emblematic of that. His entire program has been to normalize sexual deviancy. Now, if this isn't the great apostasy, I don't know what would be.
So what would you say to people like Father Jim Martin would say, oh, well, our Lord, he ate with sinners. He went to publicans' houses. He had adulterers around him. Isn't Pope Francis just doing the same thing?
Well, he's not, because he is not calling upon them to repent, which is what our Lord did when he ate with sinners. Go and sin no more, he said to the woman taken in adultery. He did not affirm her adulterous behavior. So it's one thing to reach out to people who are in a state of sin and gently reprove them and lead them to the truth. But that's not what's happening here. These people are being affirmed in terms of their so-called orientation. And the orientation is now being accepted, according to Francis and James Martin, as just a normal variation of human sexuality. When the Catechism says it's an intrinsic disorder, and that homosexual acts are acts of grave depravity. That's the Catechism. Even the modern version of the Catechism, approved by John Paul II, calls these acts acts of grave depravity. Well, they're trying to mainstream acts of grave depravity. And they're what they're saying is you should be chaste. instead of committing these acts of grave depravity. But at the same time, they're praising stable homosexual unions, as we saw in one of the early drafts. It was the midterm report or the interim relatio of the synod, the original synod, talking about how the stable relationships of homosexuals bring great comfort to them and are of benefit to them. Well, this is monstrous, of course. This is not dining with sinners or supping with sinners to bring them to conversion. It's affirming them in their sins. And James Martin, by the way, this is typical of the hypocrisy of liberals. He's calling upon all the gay priests to come out and declare their orientation as chaste homosexuals. In other words, normal sexual variants are involved here. And the priests are just being chaste like normal heterosexual people. And now we just include in normality this idea that you can have a sodomitical orientation and be chaste. But when asked about his own orientation, he conspicuously refuses to reveal it. Isn't that interesting?
What's good for the goose is not good for the gander. Yes. No, it's normalizing what used to be, the spiritual authors used to call a predominant fault, right? So everyone's born with at least one predominant fault. That's their temptation into sin. And the goal of our spiritual life is to overcome that predominant fault, not embrace it, celebrate it, treat it as, as a good. Particularly that predominant fault leads to an intrinsically evil, grave action. And, that's how they're very disingenuous, right? They want to change the vocabulary to make it sound more, as you say normal.
Well, it's very insidious, because what's going on here is, if you say that those inclined to acts of grave depravity are just exhibiting a normal variant of human sexuality, then they come into the same basket as the adulterers that Francis says sometimes just can't help themselves, because the natural law could be difficult to fulfill in one's concrete circumstances. That is situation ethics. It depends on your situation. You may find it very difficult to adhere to the natural law, but you're talking about intrinsic evils. So the idea is that you can commit intrinsic evils and be excused for it based on your concrete circumstances. Well, the entire moral order collapses when you endorse that notion. And now they want to bring in people inclined to acts of grave depravity into the ambit of this new idea of the natural law as just a benchmark, so that all of these people committing sexual sins, including the acts of grave depravity we call sodomy, are being excused if in their concrete circumstances they just can't help themselves.
Well, I just can't help myself to your car, so I guess I'll just take it.
Yeah.
Well, as goes the Pope, so goes the Church. I mean, the Pope is one of his is to be to model behavior, and we can see here in our own country his behavior of sanctioning the opposite of what the Church teaches carries on at the University of Notre, which used to be the great Catholic university of this country. So a story this week, they have a pro-life group, believe it or not. There's actually some Catholic students there still, who every year sponsors an event for pro-life organizations from Michigan and Indiana to come together and have a celebratory dinner. This was to be a really elaborate one this year because of the great work overturning Roe v. Wade at the Supreme Court by one of Notre Dame's alumna who participated in that, Amy Coney Barrett. So we're very excited. Every year, the university has basically sponsored the event, donated university funds for it. Well, the group received an email slightly before the event saying, this year, a university administrator decided the right to life, Michiana, but Michigan and Indiana combined, invited speaker transgressed the bounds of acceptable pro-life discourse. Wow, you might think, who did they invite? A terrorist? Like, who could this have been? Well, it was Ben Shapiro.
A liberal, by the way, according to our standards.
Yeah, a liberal, exactly. Even by his own standards, in many ways, a liberal. Now, again, whether you like Ben Shapiro or not, okay, maybe you don't like his style. He's certainly not off the planet, right? I mean, he is someone engaged in public discourse, and he is surprisingly extremely pro-life, and is a great representative of the pro-life movement. And but he is unacceptable is unacceptable discourse. So the university committed to academic freedom and public discourse, unless you're deemed unacceptable. So if I were Ben Shapiro, actually, here's what I would have done. I would have accused Notre Dame of being anti-Semitic because they are barring. Again, he's proud of his Jewish heritage. He's Jewish. He even asked, sadly, Bishop Barron whether he should convert to the Catholic faith, who told him, he basically said, give me your best argument, and it was don't. But
Typical of Barron, by the way.
Typical of Barron. But he is shut down as unacceptable.
Well, I'll tell you
Meanwhile,
why, though. You know why
yes,
he's shut down?
yes,
I'll tell you why he's shut down. Because he's convincing.
yes, exactly, because he's effective. Now, interestingly, the very same night this event was supposed to be taking place, that they pulled the funding from, the head of the pro-life organization said the Gender Study Program and the Institute on Race and Resilience, not really sure what that is, co-sponsored a community teach-in by reproductive care advocates at the Civil Rights Heritage Center called Post-Roe, Making Intersectional Feminist Sense of Abortion Bans. I'll offer $1,000 to anybody who can explain to me what intersectional feminist sense of abortion bans actually means. And one panelist, Sharon Lau, is the regional advocacy director for the abortion provider Whole Women's Health, and previously was a high up at Planned Parenthood and National Abortion Federation. They also have a professor there who is breaking Indiana law by helping students have illegal abortions that are outlawed in Indiana. So again, none of that is unacceptable discourse at a Catholic university or unacceptable behavior. We have who bragging on social media, a professor there who is advertising how she can help students get illegal abortions. But Ben Shapiro is.
Well, Notre Dame is completely lost to the faith, obviously, and it is appropriately called Notre Shame at this point.
Yes.
So, but this is typical of what's going on everywhere in the church. Again, as I said earlier, if this is not the great apostasy, I don't know what would be. How much worse could it be when you have a pope who basically endorses acts of grave depravity and undermines the natural law itself by reducing it to something that one can only strive to adhere to, depending upon one's concrete circumstances. So from the top down, the fish is rotting, as they say. It rots from the head. And I hate to say this about the current occupant of the chair of Peter, but to the state of Acanthus, I would say it really doesn't matter whether you think he lost his office or never had his office. Effectively, we don't have a pope, even if he was validly elected. And we're
functionally,
functionally, we don't have a pope.
Yeah,
I don't know. Does anyone who has the faith listen to him anymore? He's just prattling on about things that have nothing to do with the faith. And to the extent that he gets involved in moral issues, he's undermining morality consistently. And, of course, liturgical tradition.
Yes, of course, as we've talked about previously. But again, this is though the effect of having a pope like this in the information age, right? I mean, 1,000 years ago, if you had a pope who was not the greatest, it didn't really affect the local church, right, as dramatically. You heard who was the pope, maybe something happened here and there, but
right.
Within this age of the media, where every 45-minute meeting, every word that drips from his mouth gets plastered all over selectively by the biased media, the influence is enormous.
And he wants it to be that way. He once said that constantly giving speeches and making comments, including his airplane magisterium with all the press conferences. And he says, that's magisterium. That's what I think. So he thinks that what he thinks is the magisterium. And that's what we've seen also in the last 60 years, this tendency to talk of the magisterium of Paul VI, the magisterium of John Paul II, the magisterium of Francis, as if each pope had a customized magisterium reflecting his personal thinking, when in fact the magisterium is the constant teaching of the church, always and everywhere, which we call the deposit of the faith. And popes cannot just withdraw from the deposit of faith and throw it away or add to it, because it was given to us as the initial revelation during the apostolic age. But now we have this idea that the Pope is like a political figure and a kind of legislator who can issue basically bulletins or judicial decisions, if you want to call them that. We need a pocket part on Catholic doctrine. You see the latest doctrines at the back of the book. They slip it in.
Well, and for all want some lawyer jokes, and there's no shepherdizing because you can't go check it again. Right. I mean, really,
yeah, you would see the natural law, and if you go on an online legal research database, the natural law would have a red flag next to it. It was overruled.
Exactly. No, I mean, he's really taken Descartes' cogito ergo sum to cogito est. I think, therefore, it is. And again, this is Bishop Fillet, this Society of St. Pius X reported, that their biggest stumbling block in the doctrinal discussions were not only the details, but essentially when they would present, well, this is what the modern magisterium is teaching, this is what the church has always taught. They said, but we make the magisterium. We decide what is the truth. And they said, well, we can't really talk anymore, because if there's no ground to stand on, if you can just decide to change everything, then there's no point of any rational discussion. So therefore, you can label anyone like Ben Shapiro as outside the scope of rational discussion, because there is none.
Something struck me about the conversion story of J.D. Vance, whose election as senator is a great development for the Senate. He's an intellectual powerhouse, but he doesn't seem really quite to get it in terms of what's happening in the church. So if you read the essay he wrote about his conversion story, he said he's dismayed at the way some conservative Catholics, I think he really means traditionalists, treat the Pope as if he were a politician who could be criticized because of his policies. He's not getting it. It isn't a question of treating the Pope as a politician. It's criticizing the Pope precisely because he's acting as a politician and attempting to change the deposit of the faith. And this is an emergency in the church.
Yes.
So
no, and I agree.
Some converts don't seem to get that. They become idolaters.
I agree. Although I have to say, it's amazing to me that anyone like J.D. Vance would actually be able to convert in a time like this. That he's
intellectually honest.
Yes, but notwithstanding that error we just mentioned, I mean, to find your way to the church when she is so disfigured at this point is really a proof of the divine operation of grace. But speaking of J.D. Vance, that brings us to the state of our country. If we turn to the state, midterm elections were held recently. As we're recording this a week out, we still don't know what's won. Maybe we'll talk about that. But what we do know so far is there was predicted to be an overwhelming Republican victory and all across the board, but didn't quite turn out that way from the results we've received. So the Senate appears will be split at least 50-50, or at best 50-50, maybe 51-49 to the Democrats. House of Representatives looks on track to have Republicans.
Yeah, that's at 217, by the way, as we speak. They're one seat away.
So they're one seat away. It's up since this report.
And 13 races are still ongoing. So in order to get a majority, the Republicans would have to win 1 out of 13 races, and the Democrats would have to win all 13 of them, which is impossible. So looks like we're going to have a Republican majority in the House, which at the very least will make for some very entertaining hearings.
Hopefully, if they are true to their word in what they say they're going to do. But it's really interesting, I think, if you look at this map, and this is congressional districts, and it really shows an interesting story about our country. Again, in the first half of our country's life, there was real sectional division, right? You could draw the Mason-Dixon line, and the country was relatively divided on a lot of fundamental issues. But here we have this really strange, it always reminds me of the parable of the wheat growing up among the chaff. We're very, divided, but not in a very sort of integrated way. I mean, aside from certain states like New Mexico, but even if you look at California, it's a very liberal state, but there's just lots of areas where congressional districts have won. So it makes this very difficult politically.
Well, here we see, and there's been no greater critic of the idea of a secular nation state with a man-made constitution than I. But here we see at least the draftsmanship of the founders was quite wise in terms of the electoral college. Because if you look at this map, you see that if not for the electoral college, every election would essentially be a referendum by Los Angeles,
Yeah.
San Francisco, and New York, which would hold sway over the entire nation
Mm,
because of the numbers of people residing in these major urban centers, all controlled by crooked Democrats.
mm,
So we would have basically no control over the fate of the nation. We'd be at the mercy of a few major cities, essentially, not
mm,
even states, but just major cities in the larger, more populous states, with the one exception probably being Florida. So the
mm.
Electoral College has saved us from what Pope Leo called final disaster. But now, with the excuse of COVID, we have mass mail in balloting, which is illegal in Europe.
Mm.
In Europe, you have to vote in person with ID. But now in this country, the reason the midterms didn't turn out the way we planned is that they're doing two things, the Democrats. They're getting people to mail in ballots by the millions with no chain of custody,
Mm.
stuff them into ballot boxes with no chain of custody, and harvesting ballots. You run around to everybody you think might vote Democrat or that you can induce to vote Democrat, say in nursing homes and assisted living facilities, and you get them to sign ballots. You gather them up and run and deposit them in a box. They're great at that. That's why the midterms didn't turn out the way we planned, because the in-person voting is not even half the story anymore in
Mm.
these Democrat-controlled jurisdictions.
Well, you mentioned Europe. Not only that, but for example, in France, not known as a radically conservative country for the past 300 years, not only do they not allow that, but they require paper voting. They have no
Yes.
voting machines whatsoever. And so, again, it's interesting. But in this country, if you suggest that, you're treated like Ben Shapiro. You're treated like an alien. That's out of the realm of discourse. Well, I mean, if it works for the French, why is it so outrageous to suggest that?
Remember when we used to have election night and we actually knew the outcome of an election on the night of, or at
Yes.
worst, the following morning? Now it's election week, election month. It goes on and on and on. And these new measures, for which COVID was the excuse, are cleverly designed to allow Democrats to figure out how many ballots they need to overcome a Republican's advantage and then generate them. So with
Mm,
early voting, they keep track of the voting trends by party, and they say, the way this looks, we're going to need 50,000 more votes, and they run around and collect them.
mm,
And the people who would not have voted because they couldn't care less are voting because of the energy of organizers who go to them and basically either pressure them or somehow induce them to fill out a ballot so they can harvest it and take it in. And then the mail-in ballots. The U.S. Post Office is now election central. Unbelievable.
well, but another interesting development, if you watched it, that even in the modern context, so you have a state like Florida, one of the largest states population-wise in the country, and it basically posted almost 100% of its results. It was finalized in about 3 hours after the polls closed.
Right.
But then you have a state with a population, radically smaller, Arizona, that, is still not done. It's like 70, 80%. I mean, they're getting close. They're getting close. But again, this doesn't that point out that there's something not right here. If a state with 25 million people can, conduct an election and have the results in more quickly, that there's something not right somewhere.
Well, what happened in Arizona is may well end up prompting a recount. I think Carrie Lake was a real
Mm,
powerhouse and would have been a force for the change in the course of the history of this nation if she had become governor of Arizona. I think she may mount a challenge for one reason alone. Many thousands apparently showed up at polling centers. And it seems to be the case, we have to confirm this, that if they checked in but had not yet had their votes tabulated, they were considered to have voted. So we don't know if their votes were ever tabulated because they're considered to have voted without a tabulation just because they showed up and checked in. So you could have a discrepancy of 10,000, 15,000 votes, and it looks like Katie Hobbs is going to win by exactly that amount. 9 or 10,000 votes is what separates them now. They declared her the winner based on a 9 or 10,000 vote differential. So there may well be a recount. And also, the tabulators broke and people had to wait for hours and many got discouraged and went home. These are all things that are going to be difficult to prove, but it's obvious that the fix was in. These problems only occurred in Republican-oriented districts. Isn't that interesting?
mm,
As Carrie Lake said, the tabulator was broken. I couldn't vote in my home district. So I went to a liberal one, and everything was working fine.
Well, it's interesting, and recently I did a show over at Catholic Family News on the elections in Brazil. Interesting topic, but really, what came out of that is really all we're saying here is, none of this is direct evidence, but when you're dealing with something like an election, like the legitimacy of a government, your goal is not to just avoid technical illegal activity, but you have to avoid even the appearance of something being wrong. Why? Because it's about confidence, about people's confidence in a government, and that does seems to be what the media doesn't seem to get. That even
Yeah.
if every little and somebody says, "What about this? What about that?" and they turn out to be okay, there's no law broken. But if it gives the appearance, or that's why you would have things like a chain of custody with each party's representative watching the whole chain of custody, so that after it's over, you can say, look, there's no chance there's really anything that went wrong here. As opposed to what we seem to have now is just take my word for it. I know it looks unexplainable, but just take my word for it. And that doesn't really work when it comes to confidence and public
Well,
confidence.
I think was it Stalin who said it doesn't matter how many votes there are. What matters is who's counting the votes. And they
Yes.
and they set up a situation in which the Democrats, are counting the votes in a system in which it's impossible to have confidence, because who could have confidence in millions of mail-in ballots coming from who knows who into the post office and then into the hands of Democrat vote counters? There's so many different ways that those ballots can be tossed aside or adjudicated as defective. We'll never be able to prove it, but that's the
Mm.
point you're making. The system is fraught with potential for fraud, and if it's shot through with opportunities for fraud, who can have confidence in the outcome? I'm amazed that the Republicans won as many seats as they did in California with all of these things. Apparently, the Republicans are now catching on to the fact that they ought to go harvest ballots because it's legal in California. So that's probably part of why they're doing so well in California, relatively speaking, because they're playing the game now. But it is a game. Ballot harvesting should be illegal everywhere.
Mm.
You don't want to go to vote. You shouldn't have someone take your vote and stuff it in a box.
Well, and ultimately, it's a reminder that, we don't say our help is in the name of Mitch McConnell, right? Our help is in the name of the Lord. The Republicans, again, the Democrats have gotten so bad that they're just, off the, just out there, that the Republicans are a sort of check on them, but they're not really our salvation. I mean, there's certainly some good JD Vance and some other people are saying some good things, but as an organization, they're not fighting for Christ the King and universal principles. They are, like I said, at best, an obstruction to more communism.
Yeah, the liberals are going pell-mell into the pit of hell, and the conservatives, so-called, in the Republican Party are saying, not so fast, not so fast.
Right. So a reminder to keep it in that perspective. And, because certain people get very upset about the election. And again, we'll talk about these things, but at the end of the day, it's not, we know the true salvation is not going to come from Kevin McCarthy. It's going to come from the triumph of the Immaculate Heart, the consecration of Russia, and the period of peace given to the world by divine intervention. What form that takes, we'll see exactly how that plays out, but we know that that's where our true confidence lies.
And this is what we've been saying thematically throughout our discussions. This is the end stage of what happens when civil society is so-called emancipated from the Catholic Church. You end up with a dead body politic, a soulless, conscienceless body politic that is now in its death throes, which is obvious.
And that's what Leo the 13th predicted in Immortality Day when he said, "And the soul is separated from the body. What results? Death." And he was speaking exactly about that. When the church is separated from the body politic, death results. And we are seeing those death throes. But good. Well, that brings us really to the end of our time. A lot of interesting overlap and developments in church and state. Thank you all for your attention and look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Till we meet again.